Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. I want to remind you, as always, once again, that as an organization, Justin Center is supported by donors. We really do need your support. I would urge you to go to our donate page on the Justin Center website. We have updated that with a lot of new information. We have a brochure that you can print out if you want to help support us by letting people know about what we do, people that may be interested in the work that we do and supporting the work that we do, even if they are not themselves listening or watching our videos, who do have an interest, especially in the growth of the Lutheran Church and Lutheran thinkers and ideas in our current culture. So you can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page, download the brochure, get information there. You can print it off or send it around, and we would greatly appreciate that and any help that you can give us. Well, on the program today, we are going to be looking at a figure that I have spent some time reading quite a bit recently, and this is somebody that I was pointed to just by one of my listeners who left a comment about Stahl, and I had heard his name, and I knew a little bit about him and some other texts that I had read, speaking about Lutheranism in the 19th century in Prussia. But I hadn't really ever delved into his writings in the past, and somebody pointed me to him, so I started reading some, and I thought that this would be something that would be worth exploring in some more detail, because I think there are a lot of very helpful things in Stahl's work. Now, one of the things that we do as an organization at Justin Center is that we promote classical Lutheran theology, and a lot of the Lutheran works that we print and we share are from the 19th century and the early 20th century. Many of those are American, but some of those certainly are German in the 19th century. And the works that we publish are not strictly just theological. And the interest that we have is not just in recovering the doctrinal orthodoxy of the Lutheran Church just for the use in, say, systematic theology courses. And that's what I teach, so I love systematics or dogmatic theology. But we also believe that there are Lutheran thinkers who use their theological and philosophical insights from their Lutheran ideology, their Lutheran upbringing, their Lutheran context, and use that and apply it in various spheres of life. And so that moves beyond just the narrow field of the church, but into ethics. We have a series dealing with ethics, and into the realm of culture and art and politics. So today we're going to be delving into one of those thinkers who is a very consistently, self-consciously, confessionally Lutheran thinker, but who is working within the field of political philosophy in the 19th century. So what we have here is a political philosophy that is really informed by Stahl's confessional Lutheran convictions. And as far as political philosophers that I've read, and I spent quite a bit of time reading political philosophy, Stahl has now become my favorite by far. I think he has a very clear system. He thinks very systematically, and maybe some of that is just because he writes like a dogmatician, and that's my go-to realm of study is dogmatic theology. And he applies the kind of rigor that the dogmaticians have toward their theological discipline in terms of systematization and responding to arguments and counter-arguments and those kind of things. He takes that rigor and really applies it very well within the context of political philosophy. So when we're talking about Stahl, this is someone who is similar to an Edmund Burke type of figure in his ideas. However, he's a systematizer of these ideas, which Burke was not. Burke himself was a politician, and he wrote in response to the issues that he was facing in his day. He didn't lay out a comprehensive, systematic political theology, or political philosophy, which Stahl did. So with that, we're going to delve a little bit into some of Stahl's background, and then we're going to start talking about some of his ideas. All right, so Friedrich Julius Stahl, his years here are 1802 to 1861. Now, he's a contemporary of a lot of significant figures, as we're going to see, within the Lutheran world. So if you're familiar with the Academy in Germany and with what is sometimes called Neo-Lutheranism, which is a revival of classical Lutheran doctrine within the German Academy, you'll see that his years overlap with many figures of this era. In fact, you also see you end up seeing the year 1802 as a birth year for a number of really important figures. I was kind of surprised when I started looking at where Stahl was in terms of his relationship towards some of these other important thinkers of the time, and many of them were born in 1802. So interesting years and important for the formation of a Lutheran orthodoxy that is a kind of counter-Enlightenment, counter-modernity orthodoxy. All right. Early life. So Stahl was born in Würzburg in 1802. He was raised in a Jewish home, and not just a culturally Jewish home, but one that was very strictly religiously Jewish, observant Jews. And he, however, had met a number of Christians in his study at school, and through the Christians that he had interacted with, he converted to Christianity. Particularly, he converted to Lutheranism at the age of 17. As would probably not be surprising about any of these major thinkers that we talk about on this channel, he is recognized pretty early on as a very gifted student. He ends up studying law at 3 different schools. He goes to Würzburg, Heidelberg, and Erlangen. And those who are familiar with those, with German thought or theological thought at those times, recognize those names, especially Heidelberg and Erlangen, more than Würzburg. But he taught then after his own education at Würzburg in 1832. He was there for 2 years until 1834. And then he was offered a position to teach law at Erlangen, and he was there from 1834 to 1840. Now, Erlangen is a school that is quite significant. I mentioned this school of thought that is sometimes referred to as Neo-Lutheranism. I don't really like the term Neo-Lutheranism because when you hear that, it brings to mind things like a Neo-Orthodoxy. And Neo-Lutheranism was, and it depends on how broad you kind of cast the net in terms of defining who the Neo-Lutherans are. But Neo-Lutheranism was really intentionally, it was supposed to be a revival of the older Lutheran orthodoxy, but one that was responding to the challenges of modernity, essentially. So many of these neo-Lutheran thinkers were not simply using the 17th century Orthodox as a jumping off point to then go in completely different directions or adopt some of the false ideas of modernity. And it's not to say also that they're repristinators either, and there are some places where they depart from the 17th century writers. But it is a Lutheranism that is very faithfully confessional and intentionally so, one that is moving away from, as we'll talk about just briefly here below, Schleiermacher and the rise of Protestant liberalism, those who are saying, no, we don't have to abandon our core Christian convictions in order to be relevant to a modern age. In fact, we can offer a rigorous defense of our faith. And they were very self-consciously Lutheran. We'll talk about the Prussian Union here, where there was a forced union between Lutheran and Reformed churches. There was a battle for identity, Lutheran identity, and these thinkers were very self-consciously Lutheran rather than Reformed. So Erlangen was the center of the neo-Lutheran movement, if you can call it a movement. And so there, Stahl would have worked together with a number of really important figures. So some of his colleagues there, for example, are Gottlieb Christoph Adolf von Harless. And Harless, we publish his work on ethics, which is fantastic. Now, Harless was often considered the major figure of the Neo-Lutheran movement at Erlangen. He didn't write too extensively, though his ethics is a real masterpiece. But he was very much a thought leader. He was a leader of people. And so he really kind of galvanized those who were within that classical Lutheran tradition and brought them together at Erlangen. And so they would have been contemporaries teaching at the same time, though of course, Harless was in the realm of theology and ethics, and Stahl was in political philosophy, though there certainly is, especially between ethics and political philosophy, there's quite a bit of overlap. And there is some language that you find in Stahl which seems pretty clearly to be borrowed from Harless when you read Harless's ethics. The other figure that was there that was really important and kind of interesting for the critiques that Stahl offers too is Gottfried Thomasius. Now, Thomasius was a systematic theologian most well known for his contribution to the canonic controversy. He has a book called Christi Person und Werk, which was highly influential in promoting a kind of canonic Christology, self-emptying of the divine nature, attributes of the divine nature of Christ in the incarnation. I've got a whole video on the canonic debate that you can watch if you want to have more details on that. Now, I say that's not all of Thomasius's legacy, by the way. So Thomasius's writing is not simply to be summarized by the canonic controversy. I think he was very wrong on that issue, and I think it's a significant issue. But Thomasius also had a number of positive contributions that I think can be recognized without adopting his Christological issues. But Thomasius was he was responding to liberalism, Protestant liberalism in many ways, and he was trying to offer an alternative, but one that I think took him in bad directions. Well, Thomasius, I say, is interesting because there are other Thomasiuses that you will encounter in Stahl's writings and critiques. There are two different Thomasiuses who worked in the field of political theory and philosophy. And yes, it's the same family. But when you see that name Thomasius throughout this, or if you're reading Stahl, it's not Gottfried, because that wasn't his field. All right, so he's also teaching at, just interesting, I don't know if they had any interaction, but he was teaching at Erlangen at the same time that Christoph Ernst Luthard was a student at Erlangen. Now, Luthard is really the most important Lutheran theological figure in Germany for that Neo-Lutheran or Lutheran Orthodox movement towards the latter part of the 19th century. So he's going to be a highly influential figure and one of the best respondents to the problems of modernity and secularism. So I haven't looked enough in detail about the sources, but I know enough about the life of Luthard to know that he was there at the same time. So I don't know that there was overlap. And if any of my listeners do know, I would love to hear that. And I'm sure that you could find resources on that in German probably, but I wasn't able to find anything in English, at least. Not that there's much about Stahl in English anyway. He then taught at Berlin, and the years that he was there were 1840 to 1848. Now, this, again, was a school that was really in the midst of the orthodoxy versus modernity battles within the world of theology. And when I say theology, this extends to all fields. I mean, this is something that deals with philosophy and political theory and all sorts of other things as well. Theology in the 19th century in the German academy is not just some isolated little discipline in the corner. These are at the heart of the cultural and ideological debates that are going on at the time. Now, just to give you an idea of what's going on there at Berlin and the divides that show up there, Friedrich Schleiermacher is the founder of Protestant liberalism. He's universally said to be that. It's pretty clear that his speeches on religion to its cultured despisers in 1799 is a real turning point within not just German Protestant theology, but just theology as a whole within Europe. And what Schleiermacher proposes is a form of Christianity that in some ways appeases the rationalists, but does so by relegating religion really to the realm of feeling, and feeling has a bit of a different connotation in Schleiermacher than we probably think of it, but he doesn't mean like a kind of ecstatic experience feeling. He means something deeper, permanent, a posture of the heart. And so it is something that impacts all of our lives, but it's really to be found not in kind of objective reality, certainly not in metaphysics. There is a skepticism about our knowledge, human self-knowledge, and human knowledge of God and what we can know about the world at this point. So Schleiermacher really takes away the scientific challenges, the historical challenges, and all of his other challenges to Christianity, not by defending historic Christian belief, but instead saying, well, religion is really about posture of the heart. So he kind of sets aside the need to actually address all of those important challenges. And Schleiermacher taught at Berlin. He passed away 6 years prior to Stahl's going there to Berlin, and he was teaching there until that time. Now, along with Schleiermacher at Berlin, there was another figure who was a colleague of Stahl's while he was teaching, and that was Ernst Wilhelm Hengstenberg. Now, Hengstenberg is most well known for his books in a series. It's a series that we're actually going to be republishing, titled The Christology of the Old Testament. And Hengstenberg was very committed to classical Christian orthodoxy. He was an adamant opponent to the rising liberalism. and he believed that Scripture was divine revelation, both Old and New Testaments. And in light of the rise of historical criticism going on at this time, he defended not only the veracity and historicity of the New Testament, but the supernatural nature of the Old Testament through expanding upon its Christological prophecies and other Christological themes in the Old Testament to emphasize the unity and inspiration of the narrative of Scripture as a whole. So you see, you have probably the most rigorous and strict of the revival of the Lutheran Orthodox within Hengstenberg. And there are going to be actually Neo-Lutherans who think Hengstenberg kind of goes too far in some ways. And you see this with, there's a bit of a debate between those who are arguing for the Old Testament as basically a deposit of doctrine, which Hengstenberg would be on that side of things, where you have this kind of objective set of doctrines that are really laid out in the Old Testament. You could just kind of gather all of your doctrines there, versus the methodology of someone like Gustav Ehler, who, while he is going to hold to really just as high of a view of Scripture as Hengstenberg, he's going to argue that there is a historical development of the revelation of God's truth throughout the Old Testament. So this is what we call progressive revelation. So that's what you're going to find really developed in Ehler, but popularized, at least in a modern era, through Gerhardus Voss within the Reformed tradition. So you've got these two different takes on the Old Testament, and that kind of deposit of doctrine take is the most strict and the most anti-modernist. And so that shows up in Hengstenberg. So you see the arch anti-modernist as well as the founder of Protestant liberalism both teaching at the same school and battling each other. So all of that is important because this is the context into which Stahl is entering when he starts his teaching career and his work. So he's really in the midst of a lot of battles now. Now, again, you may look at this and say, well, these are battles within the world of theology. You know, it's like, who knows, or what impact does it have on society if you've got two seminary professors at a seminary that disagree on something and they're debating all the time? And at the time, this was far beyond mere theology professors at a seminary arguing with one another. These individuals and these ideologies were really controlling what was going on in Germany, as well as really as in Europe as a whole, in many ways. Not that the German Academy was the only important influence, of course, but highly significant. And so this is a broader battle that's really going to affect how politics are run and how we see ourselves, ethics, religion, and theology, the role of the human being in society. So this has broad implications. And to be clear, I'm a theologian, and I think it's very important to delve into theological particulars. And even if it is in a little seminary with two professors arguing, I think that's important, and I care about those things. But this is not to say that that's unimportant, but this is just to say that this is something that is going beyond the field of theology, especially when we're looking at an individual like Stahl, who's not directly within the field of theology, though in many ways he does kind of see political philosophy as a kind of sub-discipline of theology in the way that he treats it. So there's the kind of ideological context, the battles that are going on in Stahl's time. But then we also have to spend a little bit of time outlining the politics in Prussia. And as much as I would love to just delve right into the ideas of Stahl, I just think all of this is important background to really get at what he's talking about. I don't think you'll understand him as well if you don't know the theological and political context into which he is writing. So Prussia, if you're not familiar with exactly what Prussia is, it's in northern Germany. It's not exclusively in northern Germany, but mostly located in northern Germany. I have a map here that you probably can't see because it's kind of small, but it is on the slide. So Prussia had been made its own kingdom in 1701 under King Friedrich I. He self-appointed himself as king. You know, there was no inheritance of that kingly title from anybody else. Now, Germany at this time is not a unified nation. Not that it's not a nation, but it's not solely unified, clearly. And this is one of the battles that you're going to find throughout the 19th century, is how unified and centralized should Germany be. It's really a number of independent states that are loosely connected with one another. And you see this even back in the political time of Martin Luther, where you have princes over different areas of Germany, then the Holy Roman Empire. And those princes were able to determine what was happening in their districts in a pretty significant way. Like they differed from each other pretty significantly. Okay, so at this time, Prussia becomes its own independent state. They have their own king. The other Germans didn't always use the title king to refer to him. as they didn't quite accept his kingly status that he declared upon himself. When you hear about the Prussians and you read about this era, you're going to see one name show up over and over again, and that is not Friedrich the First, but Friedrich II. And he's referred to often as Frederick the Great. Well, anytime somebody's referred to as the Great, it means, well, people think they're pretty great. So it means he's somebody that has significance. He's very important. People looked up to him and think that his reign was generally quite positive. And his years are 1712 to 1786. Now, Friedrich II is known for a number of things, but I have just included 4 here to see what people are looking at when they're thinking about the kind of golden age in Prussia, when they're looking back on the past after the next king that we're going to look at. They're looking back to Friedrich II and thinking things were much better then. And so one of the things that Friedrich II promoted was the arts and philosophy. He believed that the study of philosophy, the study of the arts, and really theology as well, were essential to culture and essential to a nation and national identity. He was known for his support financially of the arts and the flourishing of both the arts and philosophy in Prussia. Under Friedrich II, there was some increased social mobility, so people were able to move classes from a lower to a more middle class status more easily, and there were certain laws put in place that allowed that to happen more easily. There was, under Frederick, a relative freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And so there was a loosening of some of the strictures around what the press could print and what religious practices could be observed. Now, when we're talking about freedom of religion and freedom of the press in the mid-18th century, we're not really talking about what we tend to think of it as today. He also encouraged immigration significantly. This was part of his strategy to grow the nation and grow the power and influence of Prussia. Okay, that's Friedrich II. Those are some of the things that he's known for. Now we get to Friedrich William II. He reigns from 1786 to 1797. Now, his reign was not quite as positive in the minds of many in Prussia as his predecessor. And one of the things that Friedrich William did was he forced the Prussian Union. And this was really an attempt to strengthen, in his view, strengthen the church in Prussia and strengthen particularly the Protestant church in Prussia, not Russia, by uniting both the Lutheran and the Reformed factions of the church into one. And so he forced those churches to come together to form one larger church, what is known as the Prussian Union. The creation of the Prussian Union made it quite difficult for Lutherans in particular to worship how they wanted to worship. And the Prussian Union for Lutherans was really compromise. It was compromise on their view of the sacraments and how they viewed worship, while the Reformed historically have been more willing to work with Lutherans in terms of worship and to see commonality with Lutherans. Lutherans historically have always been much more hesitant to do things like commune with the Reformed or have Reformed pastors preach in their pulpits because in our view, that is, the differences are significant enough that to do so is to compromise our own heritage and our own doctrine, beliefs, and practices. So what was happening at this time was there was fear, and I think it was happening, that the distinctive Lutheran culture and practices and doctrine was really being lost or subsumed under the Reformed. And this led to a lot of division. It led to a lot of fighting among the Lutherans in Prussia. And it really kind of, in some ways, created Neo-Lutheranism. It led to this, and Schleiermacher and the like, because it led to a need to recognize distinctive Lutheran identity in a way that perhaps hadn't been maybe fought for previously because it had been taken for granted. So Friedrich William also fought with the Austrians against revolutionary France. So you have this time of the French Revolution, the American Revolution just happened, then you have the French Revolution, and so the attitudes toward the French Revolution are going to differ significantly among the Prussian people, and that's going to lead to some of the political divides that happen. So they fight with the Austrians against revolutionary France. So the crown certainly is opposed to revolutionary France. They end up getting defeated later by Napoleon, and eventually they're forced to pay tribute to Napoleon pretty extensively. This leads to a weakening of Prussia and a lot of political unrest. All right, so then you've got the divide that's going on in Prussia at this time between conservatives and liberals. Now, conservatives and liberals, when you generally think of those terms, we probably think mostly of the Anglo world. We're thinking of, say, Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine. So we're looking at England and we're looking at the United States. But there are conservatives and liberals within Prussia as well. They're watching what's going on in France, and they have different attitudes about what's going on there. Now, the conservative and liberal divide in Prussia is not exactly as clear-cut as perhaps it may be in some other areas, like we see in some of the English attitudes, for example. What you've got to understand is, after there's this defeat by Napoleon, and it's seen that Prussia is significantly weakened, this kind of great era that they had before had really come to an end. And they've seen revolutions, we've seen the American Revolution, we've seen the French Revolution. And so the Prussians are just asking, well, how do we look at these things? Perhaps the old ways that we have done things are wrong, and perhaps what we need is significant reform. Maybe we need a revolution like France has. Others said, no, we need to go back to the reign of our prior king and delve more into traditionalism. What's gone wrong is that we have now departed from that. So there are different views in terms of conserving what was the past in Prussia versus a more progressive attitude that says we want to follow some of the ideology of the French Revolution that's going to strengthen Prussia. So there are a number of individuals that are arguing for reforms at this time. Now, initially, it had been my perception, until I started doing more reading on this area, that the Prussian reformers were basically synonymous with the liberals, synonymous with those who were supportive of, say, the French Revolution and had that more revolutionary attitude. But that's actually not the case. It's not, the conservative-liberal divide is not simply those who argued for reform versus the conservatives, because there were some who were quite conservative in their arguments for reform as well. So the divide isn't so clear-cut. One of the unifying ideas behind a lot of the reformers was that there was an attempt to have the unification of one single German nation. And so it was the argument that, us having these little territories, these little kingdoms that are divided from one another and governed independently has really weakened us militarily and culturally. And so there was a kind of growing nationalism, an argument that we need to strengthen the German nation. Then the reformers also supported the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech. Okay, that makes sense with the American Revolution, certainly, some parallels there. They argued for constitutionalism. They argued for a lessened power of the nobility. And there were some different attitudes of those individuals toward the kings. Some argued for just a very, very lessened power in terms of what was entrusted to the king, whereas others wanted to get rid of the kings altogether in Prussia. Now, there was a significant divide among these who argued that we needed reform. You had basically Enlightenment statists, and Hardenberg, Karl August von Hardenberg, is the most important representative there. Though even he kind of pulls back on some of those reforms. So even when you look at the kind of Enlightenment pro-revolutionary figures, they still are not, in Prussia, they're not as radical as the French were. Hardenberg he adheres to the ideals of the Enlightenment. The importance of and reliance on rationality, the notion of government as social contract, some of the things that really are going to form, say, Lockean views of government. So in that way, they adhere to Enlightenment ideas, the centrality of the individual and the necessity of individual freedom as a core of what the nation is. But they were also statists. These were individuals that were highly nationalistic and argued for, not necessarily for small government, in some ways they did, but other ways for large government or a powerful government. And then you also had anti-Enlightenment figures that were also reformers. They argued for reform, but ones that were not so rooted in the pure trust in the nature of human reason. And so Stein is an example of that wing of the party. They're also anti-absolutists. They don't want a kind of absolute power given into the hands of the nobility or whoever it is that is in charge in whatever government reforms or change would have happened in this one German nation that they are arguing for. Now, the Prussian conservatives, again, it's not that clear of a unified group. You have a number of different individuals. Some of them are more just kind of reactionaries, but others are far more thoughtful conservatives. And Stahl, I think, is certainly the best of these. But you have a couple things that the conservatives tend to emphasize here. One is constitutional monarchy. And so they believe that the monarchy, the nobility, is essential to both historical continuity as well as just the overall political success of Prussia. But they were not arguing for some kind of absolutism in terms of authority that was given to the monarchy. And I think this is some of the reason why there's such a distinction between the kind of extremism you see at France at this time versus Germany not going to the same kind of extremes, is because in France you really did have this absolutist kind of nobility, depending on the divine right of kings in terms of how that was interpreted in France. And the conservatives that you find here in Prussia are much more moderated. They're not arguing for some kind of absolute power at all. They're arguing for a constitutional monarchy. And so they want something that is, historic in their adoption of the nobility and their retaining of titles of nobility and things like that, but also of borrowing some elements from, say, American constitutionalism. And not to say that they're solely borrowing from American tradition. The second thing that pretty much unites the conservatives here is that there is a general skepticism toward a centralized government, and they would rather see the continuance of a kind of relative independence of individual German states. And this maybe is different from how you tend to think of conservative and liberal today, because right now you've got the kind of nationalist, at least in the U.S., you've got the nationalist movements and that tend to be the conservative movements, and the kind of anti-nationalist movements, perhaps, that are the more progressive movements. But if anything, if you're going to cite some group as nationalists, it's going to be more of the reformers, especially those who are more, Enlightenment liberals. You're going to see it more there than you are in the conservatives, whereas the conservatives are going to focus a lot more on local community. They're going to care about the lived area, the traditions and rights, an inheritance of the place that you live in, rather than just thinking of the state as this kind of overarching independent entity working and having control over the people. All right, so let's see. Let's move on here. Now we've got information about kind of what Stahl did in terms of his political career. Now, his major political philosophy text, and it's a great work. It's a brilliant work. It has largely been translated. Not the entirety of it has not been translated into English. But it's called The Philosophy of Law from a Historical Perspective. And there's a historical school of law that Stahl was trained in, that he is really expanding upon it and departing from in some ways. That's where the name at least comes from. And so this was released in 3 separate volumes, 1829 to 1833. There are some edits that were added in later editions. So there are multiple editions, but that's the initial edition of the work. And while he was in Berlin, remember, this was the school of Schleiermacher. This was the school where you had a significant number of both faculty and students arguing for the reforms of modernity, the irrelevancy of classical dogmatic ideas, classical philosophy, and things like that. So Stahl there was quite outspoken, very outspoken. And thankfully, I'm glad he was outspoken. He should have been. But this got him into a significant amount of trouble. So he was criticized by a lot of the faculty. Eventually, it got to the point that they had a petition to get him fired for his conservative views. This did eventually actually lead him to leave the university because things got so heated. He then sought to spread conservative ideas through writing. And so he founded a conservative newspaper in Berlin then in 1848. And there are a number of articles that he has written. These haven't really been translated into English, but articles that delve into what he sees as a needed conservative party within Germany. And he outlined some ideas for what the ideological backing and then, and policy-wise as well, that would be promoted by this conservative party. So then he writes these ideas in a text called A Draft for a Conservative Party then in 1849. All right, so those are Stahl's political endeavors and what he had done in terms of writing and other things. So what is his relationship then to the Lutheran Church? Well, he is appointed as a member of the Prussian Evangelical Higher Church Council. The years here are, I guess I said 1852 to 1852, and I think it was very short-lived, but I don't think it was that short-lived. So I must have had, I think it was 1853. I think it was only about a year. But so he is appointed part of this church council that is overseeing what's happening in the state church. And Stahl was an adamant opponent of the Prussian Union. And Stahl argued for political philosophy and theology are intimately tied together because what he is arguing for is a Christian state. And that's very clear in his writings. And he believed that Germany was a Christian state, and he believed that the nations of Europe were as a whole Christian states. And by saying that, and we can look at some of the specifics as we get into his writings, what he is not saying is that the governments of Western Europe should require church attendance by all members or punish heresy, with the sword or anything like that. But he outlines pretty clearly, this is the inheritance, this is the culture, and these are the ideals that we have inherited that have formed the way that we view ourselves. They have formed our customs, our traditions, how we understand one another, how we understand human dignity, and basically have formed the entire worldview of the Western world. So what he's saying here is, even if the peoples of Germany are not Christian, we're not going to convert people by the sword, it has to be recognized that there are Christian ideals that have shaped the culture of our people. So in that way, he would say that we are a Christian culture. He argued for strict confessionalism within the state church. He argued that adherence to the Lutheran confessions, as outlined in the Book of Concord, should be required for all clergy in the Lutheran Church. I love it. Sounds great. No, at this time, you have pastors who are the Schleiermachian types in the state church who are basically teaching that the propositional truths of the Christian faith are false, and that instead we can defend Christianity merely as something that is about our affections or our feelings. And so Stahl wants to stop this and instead require confessionalism in the state church. Now, clearly this didn't happen. Okay, these are things that Stahl pushed for and things that Stahl believed would have been best for society. Now, he promotes a strong distinction between clergy and laity. And Stahl recognized the importance of hierarchy and the importance of authorities, both in the church and in the state. What he was seeing both in the church and in the kind of revolutionary cultures like you see in France was a diminishing of authority, a diminishing of divine offices. And by divine offices, I don't just mean the holy ministry, but I mean the offices that God has placed people in, whether that's in the secular in the historic sense, not in the secular in a religious sense, but we could talk about that too. But and this is very Luther. If you read Luther, and I'll get myself in trouble here, people may think of him as kind of a populist figure, and I don't really see Luther that way. And I guess it depends on what you mean by populist. What I mean is that Luther cared deeply about the people of his nation, very much so. And he believed that they should all have access to education, that all people should have access to Scripture in their own language, that people should be able to have hymnody that would express their worship in their own language. Luther was very much a champion of the peasants, of those who had no high position in the church or in the world, according to the state. However, Luther very strongly emphasized the need for and the importance of vocational callings that are pretty much hierarchical. Luther was an adamant defender of hierarchy. I mean, this is just, I think this is apparent when you look at his writings to the princes. The kind of respect that he calls for those who are not in authority to give to their authorities is one that I think the way that he expresses it, I think would shock many Americans today, or many people in the West today in general. So, okay, it depends on what you mean by populist, because I tend to think of populists as kind of always being those who are always skeptical of anyone who is in an elite position and have this kind of constant the people versus the leaders mentality, and that really was not at all Luther's mentality. So I think Stahl gets his very strict understanding of hierarchy and the importance of hierarchy really from the Lutheran tradition, and it's very deeply within the Lutheran tradition. And you see this as well when you read many later Lutheran figures. And I've actually thought about writing a paper on the conservatism of Martin Luther. And I've thought about it. I haven't done it yet at this point. But basically what I want to do is take the 5 principles of conservatism that Russell Kirk outlines. He's got a little booklet, which some of you may be familiar with, and use that kind of as a template to say, this is very Luther. Like, Luther is adamant on all of these points. As strange as that may seem, because we tend to think of Luther as a kind of revolutionary, and I understand why. I get that. I think there's certainly a rebelliousness in Luther in his writings, but that has to be tempered by his strong emphasis on the nature of authority. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. I know I've said too much. Okay, so Stahl argues for a strong distinction between clergy and laity. This is opposed to the pietist approach, and the pietists had really weakened the office of the ministry in many ways. And that's not always the case, because there are many different brands of pietism, and I don't think pietism is all bad. I know that people tend to think it is. But this is one of the unfortunate consequences of pietism, is that, on the one hand, the good thing is that it uplifted the laity. It argued for and set up ways in which lay people can join together in Bible study and read Scripture together. It gave access to the spiritual life and the life of the reading of Scripture to the laity in a way that they didn't have before. All those things are very good. The unfortunate thing is, by empowering the laity, there was also a diminishing of the clergy and a kind of skepticism toward the clergy that really ended up being endemic to a lot of aspects of the pietist movement. So then, along with this distinction between clergy and laity, Stahl argued for a historic episcopate. And he believed that the historic episcopate would help the church in a couple different ways. One is that it would establish a line of connection. It would establish a historical line of connection to the church, both before and after. But the other thing is that if there was an episcopate, those bishops would be able to control the teaching and doctrine of the Lutheran Church in a way that wasn't happening at this time. And this has been a problem within Germany since the Reformation, is that too often that the political leaders in Germany had sway over the church, rather than there being a separate hierarchical ecclesiastical leadership to take that role. Now, there were always, when you read the theologians of the Lutheran tradition within Germany, you can read Gerhard or plenty of others that talk about the distinctive role of the prince versus the role of the church, and they're not conflating things, but often it ends up that way. And so, again, with this hierarchical emphasis, it makes sense that Stahl would argue for a historic episcopacy. Well, unfortunately, I would think, but I understand others may disagree with me, and I don't want to be too adamant about that. It didn't happen. Okay, now let's talk about Stahl's influences. Who influences him? Who are the major figures that he is reading? Well, he initially studies Hegel, and Hegel is an interesting figure in terms of where you place him in terms of political ideology, because he is often considered kind of a conservative in some ways, but in many ways, his historical philosophy is explicitly progressive, in that it's this, Hegel's view of history is that it is this constantly changing and ever growing and kind of progressing thing. But he also had quite conservative ideas in a number of other ways. And the historical school of thought is actually, that you find in Hegel, has some parallels to other historical schools of law. But despite what you want to say about Hegel, because that's a bit debated, and I've heard some people say that he was kind of conservative just incidentally, but not due to his philosophy. So he was dissatisfied with Hegel, and Hegel was kind of the major figure that people were reading at this time. He then encounters Friedrich Karl von Savigny. His years are 1779 to 1861. He was the most influential leader in what was called the historical school of law within Germany. And the historical school of law essentially said it was an alternative to what we find in Enlightenment liberalism. And Enlightenment liberalism, there is a notion that we can judge the role of the state, the needs of the state, the ethical norms that should be pushed by the state by a kind of pure, rational thought experiment. Right? You start with what are humans like? What are humans like in a kind of state of nature, this primitive state apart from government or community? And Stahl's going to argue against this idea altogether. And they're going to say that, okay, well, what we can do from that is kind of come up with these rational principles of what the role of the government is, and then apply those universally everywhere. That is a fundamental conviction of liberalism, at least classical liberalism. This is the reason why many liberal governments have tried to overthrow governments or regimes in other nations that don't live by these liberal principles, and then try to install liberal governments in those nations. Doesn't work, but this is the result of what you find in the kind of objectivizing, the rational objectivizing of law, just as universal kind of theoretical principle. So Savigny says that law essentially cannot be divorced from national character. So it's called the historic school because they're looking at the development of nations within history. And what Savigny, and I think Stahl gives the best categories to use when talking about this, but what he's not arguing is that this means that law is purely subjective, that any nation can have any law it wants, and nations just develop how they do, and they just develop laws, but there's no such thing as a just or unjust law. It's just a product of historical circumstance. That's not what he's saying. But we can't divorce law from national character, that there are things about a people, a nation, a place, a culture, a way of speech, manners, all of these things that really define society and define how it is that law should be implemented in that particular culture. And so law and politics, the state in general, kind of arises from the culture of the people. It is not this abstract thing from up here that is to be imposed upon people, like you find in, the John Locke types. Not saying that Locke tried to do that, but that's kind of the ideology that leads to, I think. And I think Locke doesn't certainly pay enough attention, I think, to the historical and unique circumstances of cultures. But perhaps Kant maybe is really more the one I would blame for the universalizing of those principles. But another thing that you find in Savigny is he begins a process of recovery of Roman law. So he's studying the law in Rome, and Greece as well, but Rome more specifically. And there is a going back to older sources and looking at Roman law as the foundation for law as it is discovered in the West, and trying to find wisdom within Roman law that can be applicable to a modern day. So this kind of conservatism, this kind of traditionalism, is not only one that recognizes national character as it is, but is also trying to go back to older classical sources that have informed the way that we in the West view law. Stahl is also influenced by Schelling. Now, Schelling is one who worked with Hegel. He has a very similar kind of historically developed philosophy. Schelling was Lutheran in name, at least. So, but I haven't spent a lot of time looking into Schelling's political philosophy. He didn't write a book on political philosophy, but there are implications for political philosophy that can be taken from certain sections of his work. And I just have not had the time to delve into that. And Schelling is a character that, because he was within that Lutheran milieu too, it'd probably be worthwhile to spend some more time on. I just haven't had the opportunity to do that at this point. All right, then we have the final figure. That's the one that's shown in this picture here, that's Edmund Burke. Now, Burke, of course, he's not German. He's not dealing with the political situation of Germany. But there is much wisdom about the role of government, opposition to revolution, the nature of hierarchy, the importance of beauty, things that Stahl emphasizes very distinctly that show up in Burke's writings. And so in some ways, it can be said that Stahl is kind of just a systematic form of Burke's thought. Think of Burke as the kind of Luther figure who, he's responding to the issues of his day, and he's writing letters and tracts and treatises. And Stahl is more of the Melanchthon or Martin Chemnitz, the figure who kind of takes those ideas and systematizes them, right? Says, okay, how do these things fit into a system? How does this relate to this? Why is it that we're arguing this? What's the presupposition here? And does all of that, I think, necessary work to categorize these things. Now, that's not to say that Stahl is merely doing that. There's more to Stahl than just that. But it's clear that the kind of conservatism that you find in Stahl is very influenced by Burke, and it relies to some significant degree on what Burke did, though Stahl is much more explicitly a theologian than Burke. And I think Burke certainly considered himself a Christian, but I think you find in his writings there is a bit of an emphasis on religion as more of an emphasis on religion as necessary for social cohesion in the history of England than probably the objective validity of the Christian religion, whereas Stahl certainly talks about both, but much more the latter. So, all right, well, there is the end of my background of Friedrich Julius Stahl, and we are close to an hour, and I haven't even touched on any of his ideas. So, okay, so this is the first part of this. I guess this will be a multi-part talk, and I know that I could have just delved into his ideas. However, I don't think it would give the best presentation of his thought in a way that I think it deserves. The influences, the historical context, I think is absolutely necessary if you want to see what Stahl was doing and why he's important. So, next time, we're going to talk about the specific ideas of Stahl as outlined in his masterwork on the principles of law. So I hope you found this interesting. I know it's a little bit different. It's one of these things that is not directly theological, though I'm kind of trying to make the argument that it largely is theological because none of this can be divorced from theology. But this is a history lesson for you. This history actually is helpful for some of the other figures that I'm going to be planning on looking at as well, because I want to dive into some of the other people in 19th century Germany within the Lutheran tradition that write in a number of different fields, and the importance of those figures today and how we can use them to deal with some of our same cultural problems today. I think when we look at a figure like an Ernst Luthard or an Adolf von Harless, we see great truths that can apply in our situation today as well as they did at the time that those texts were written. Well, thanks so much for watching and or listening to this, and I hope you found it interesting at least, and you feel like you learned something. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.